March 19th, 1943. The morning air hung cold and heavy over the Henschel and Zone proving grounds outside Kassel, Germany. A freight car had just delivered something that would fundamentally alter one engineer's understanding of the war. A captured American M4 Sherman tank, taken intact from the North African theater just 2 weeks earlier after its crew abandoned it during a chaotic retreat. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Heinrich Kniepkamp approached the vehicle with the careful eye of a man who had spent his entire career perfecting the art of armored vehicle design. As chief engineer of Germany's tank development program, he had designed suspension systems for the Panzer III and IV. He understood armor, tolerances, and engineering principles better than almost anyone in the Third Reich. He had been told to expect something interesting. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Sherman sat under grey skies, its angular, utilitarian form still covered in North African dust. Its olive drab paint seemed almost crude compared to the elegant lines of German panzers. But Kniepkamp wasn't concerned with aesthetics. He was examining the welds, running his hands along hull joints, feeling the rough texture of metal, observing the inconsistent bead patterns and surface imperfections that would never pass German quality control standards. He pulled out measuring calipers and checked the tolerances on the hatches. They were loose, imprecise, built to margins that German factories would immediately reject as unacceptable. Fritz Müller, one of his assistant engineers, examined the engine compartment access panels with visible disgust. "This is terrible workmanship," Müller declared. "Look at this welding. Look at these panel gaps. This wouldn't last a week in Russian mud." Kniepkamp said nothing. He was thinking about something else entirely, something that made all those imperfections suddenly terrifyingly irrelevant. To understand Kniepkamp's growing unease, one must first understand the context of March 1943. Germany was still winning battles in North Africa. The Eastern Front, though brutal, remained under German control. The Wehrmacht's confidence in the technical superiority of its armored forces seemed justified by results. The Panzer IV had been upgraded repeatedly, its long 75mm gun now capable of destroying any Allied tank at range. The Tiger. I had entered service 6 months earlier, a 56-ton monster with armor so thick that Allied anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate it from the front. German tank crews were the best trained in the world, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and 2 years of brutal combat in Russia. The German military-industrial complex had built its reputation on precision engineering, on quality over quantity, on the fundamental principle that superior German technology and craftsmanship would always overcome crude Allied mass production. This wasn't mere propaganda. This was doctrine, embedded in every specification, every manufacturing standard, every design decision. German tanks took longer to build because they were built correctly. They cost more because they were worth more. They required more skilled labor because they were precision instruments of war, not crude machinery hastily welded together. Adolf Hitler himself had reinforced this belief in a speech to tank commanders in January 1943. "One German tank," he had declared, "is worth 10 American tanks. Our engineering excellence will always defeat their quantity." The tank commanders believed him because their experience supported it. In North Africa, single Tigers had destroyed a dozen British tanks in single engagements. On the Eastern Front, German panzers routinely defeated Soviet tanks that outnumbered them 3 or 4 to 1. Quality over quantity wasn't just a slogan, it was observable reality, proven in battle after battle. But Heinrich Kniepkamp was about to discover that quantity has a quality all its own. Kniepkamp opened the Sherman's engine compartment fully and stood in silence. Müller joined him, looking over his shoulder at the right R975 Whirlwind radial engine, a 9-cylinder air-cooled aircraft engine that the Americans had simply bolted into a tank. It seemed an absurd solution, crude and inelegant. Aircraft engines belonged in aircraft. Tanks needed purpose-built power plants designed specifically for the unique demands of armored warfare. They put an airplane engine in a tank, Müller said, his voice thick with contempt. This is what we're worried about. This is American engineering. But Kniepkamp was doing calculations in his head. He pulled out his notebook and started writing numbers. The radial engine was unsophisticated. Yes, but it was also mass-produced. America built thousands of these engines for training aircraft, for transport planes, for applications where they needed simple, reliable power that could be maintained by mechanics with basic training. The engine wasn't designed for tanks. It was designed to be built quickly and in enormous numbers. How many of these engines can they make? Kniepkamp asked quietly. Müller shrugged. I don't know. Thousands. But what does it matter? The engine is underpowered. This tank can't weigh more than 30 tons, and they're using a 400 horsepower engine. Our Panzer IV has 300 horsepower, but weighs 25 tons. The power-to-weight ratio is terrible. Kniepkamp wasn't listening. He was examining the transmission, the suspension, the tracks. Everything was standardized, built to loose tolerances that would horrify German quality inspectors, but that meant parts were completely interchangeable. Any Sherman track link would fit any Sherman. Any road wheel would mount on any bogie. The entire tank was designed not for precision, but for masses, production and field maintenance. He walked to the front of the tank and examined the armor. 51 millimeters on the frontal plate, vertical, not sloped. Pathetic by German standards. A Panzer IV's long gun would punch through this armor at over 1,000 meters. The Tiger's 88mm gun would penetrate it at 2,000 meters. The Sherman's own 75mm gun was a low-velocity design, adequate against other tanks, but inferior to German guns in both penetration and range. This tank is inferior to the Panzer IV in almost every measurable way, Müller concluded. Thinner armor, weaker gun, crude construction. I don't understand why we're even bothering with this analysis. Kniepkamp pulled out a folder of intelligence reports that had arrived with the tank. They contained transcripts from interrogations of captured American tank crews, translated documents recovered from destroyed Allied vehicles, and analysis from German agents in neutral countries who monitored American industrial output. He had read these reports 3 times on the train from Berlin. Each time, he had hoped he had misunderstood something, misread a decimal point, confused a monthly figure with an annual figure. He hadn't. Fritz, Kniepkamp said, his voice very quiet, how many Panzer IVs did we produce last month? Müller thought for a moment. I believe the February figures showed 250 units. Production is increasing. We should reach 300 per month by summer. 300 per month, Kniepkamp repeated. He opened the folder and pulled out a document marked Streng Geheim, top secret. It was an intelligence assessment of American tank production based on information gathered from multiple sources, intercepted communications, aerial reconnaissance of American factories, reports from agents in Mexico and South America who monitored cargo shipments. The document estimated American Sherman production at 2,000 tanks per month. Müller took the paper from Kniepkamp's hand and read it. His face went pale. This must be wrong. This has to be propaganda. American propaganda that somehow made it into our intelligence files. Keep reading, Kniepkamp said. Müller read further. The report detailed American production facilities, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Detroit, the Fisher Body Plant in Grand Blanc, the Ford Motor Company facility in Dearborn, the Pacific Car and Foundry in Renton, the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. 11 major factories, each producing between 100 and 300 Shermans per month. The report included photographs taken by high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, showing assembly lines that stretched for hundreds of meters, showing storage yards filled with completed tanks waiting for shipment. Even if this is accurate, Müller said, his voice shaking slightly, even if they're building 2,000 tanks per month, they're building inferior tanks. Quality still matters. A Panzer IV is worth 3 Shermans, a Tiger is worth 10. Kniepkamp did the math in his head. If Germany produced 300 Panzer IVs per month and America produced 2,000 Shermans per month, then even assuming a 3-to-1 kill ratio in Germany's favor, the Americans could lose 600 tanks per month and still gain ground. They could afford to trade 3 Shermans for every Panzer IV and still overwhelm German forces through sheer numbers. But the intelligence report wasn't finished. Kniepkamp turned to the final page, where the analyst had included projected production figures for 1943. The Americans weren't planning to maintain production at 2,000 per month. They were planning to increase it. By the end of the year, the report estimated American factories would be producing between 2,500 and 3,000 Sherman tanks per month. 3,000 tanks per month. That was more tanks than Germany's entire armored force on the Eastern Front, every month. Month after month. Forever. If this story is capturing your attention, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth historical content like this. "We need to see this thing in action," Müller said, his voice hollow. "We need to test it, understand its weaknesses, find out how to kill it efficiently." They spent the next week putting the Sherman through every test they could devise. They drove it across the Kassel, proving grounds, through mud and over obstacles, testing its mobility and reliability. The suspension was simple. A vertical volet spring system that was crude compared to German torsion bars, but that worked reliably and could be repaired quickly with basic tools. The tracks were rubber-blocked, narrower than German tracks, but adequate for most terrain. The engine, despite being an aircraft design, ran smoothly and didn't overheat, even under sustained operation. It was easy to access, easy to service, designed so that a crew with minimal training could perform basic maintenance in the field. A German tank crew needed specialized tools and factory-trained mechanics for major engine work. A Sherman crew needed wrenches and common sense. They test-fired the 75mm gun at various ranges against armor plates. The gun was indeed inferior to German weapons in penetration, but it was reliable, easy to operate, and used ammunition that was simple to manufacture. The rate of fire was impressive, faster than a Panzer IV's gun, because the Sherman's turret was more spacious and better laid out for the crew. Kniepkamp watched a loader feed shells into the gun, smooth and practiced despite being German and unfamiliar with the vehicle. The turret basket rotated smoothly. The gun controls were simple, almost crude in their design, but they worked. Everything about the Sherman was designed to work, not to be elegant or sophisticated, but to function reliably under battlefield conditions with crews that might have only weeks of training. On the 5th day of testing, they brought in a Panzer IV for comparison. The German tank sat next to the Sherman, and the differences were stark. The Panzer IV was sleeker, more refined, with torsion bar suspension and a more powerful gun. Its armor was better angled, its engineering more sophisticated. It looked like a precision instrument next to the American tank's crude simplicity, but when they opened both engines and laid out the components side by side, something became clear that Kniepkamp had suspected from the beginning. The Panzer IV's Maybach engine was a masterpiece of German engineering, precisely machined, beautifully designed, requiring highly skilled workers and specialized tools to manufacture. The Sherman's radial engine was basically identical to thousands of engines already in production for other purposes, built on assembly lines by semi-skilled workers, serviceable by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge. If a Panzer IV engine failed in combat, the tank needed to be recovered and sent to a rear area workshop with trained mechanics and proper equipment. If a Sherman engine failed, the crew could replace it in the field. American supply doctrine included spare engines as standard equipment. German supply doctrine assumed tanks would be repaired by professionals at dedicated facilities. "It's designed for mass production," Kniepkamp said, more to himself than to Müller. "Every decision, every component, everything about this tank is optimized not for performance, but for manufacturing speed and field maintenance. They've accepted performance compromises to make a tank that can be built quickly and kept running by ordinary soldiers." Müller was examining the ammunition storage. "They carry more shells than we do. 90 rounds for the 75mm gun compared to our 87. And look at this." He pointed to the ready racks. "The ammunition is stored more safely, less likely to explode if the tank is penetrated. The list of small advantages kept growing. The Sherman had better crew visibility through more numerous periscopes. It had a gyro-stabilized gun that allowed firing while moving, something German tanks lacked. It had a protected floor escape hatch that gave the crew a better chance of surviving if the tank was hit. None of these features were revolutionary. All of them were practical. On the seventh day, they conducted live fire tests, shooting at the Sherman with various German anti-tank weapons to determine how easily it could be destroyed. A Panzer Porfis 75mm gun penetrated the frontal armor at 1,500 meters. The 88mm gun on the Tiger went through it at over 2,000 meters. Even the standard towed 75mm anti-tank gun could kill a Sherman frontally at combat ranges. "There," Müller said with something like relief. "It's vulnerable. A properly positioned Panzer IV can destroy 3 or 4 Shermans before they can close to effective range." Kniepkamp was looking at the intelligence reports again, doing more calculations. If they're producing 3,000 tanks per month by year's end, that's 36,000 tanks per year. Fritz, do you know how many Panzer IVs we've built in total since production started in 1937? Müller didn't answer. He knew the number. Around 8,500 tanks in 6 years. The Americans, Kniepkamp continued, will build more Shermans in 1 year than we've built Panzer IVs in the entire history of the program. And they're also building other tanks, tank destroyers, armored cars, half-tracks. This is just the Sherman production, just one tank model. He pulled out another document, this one detailing American automotive production capacity. Before the war, American factories had produced over 4 million cars per year. 4 million vehicles. When the war started, those factories converted to military production almost overnight. The Chrysler tank arsenal had been a car factory, so had the Fisher body plant. American industry wasn't building tanks instead of cars. It was building tanks using the same methods that built millions of cars. Germany's entire automotive industry before the war produced maybe 300,000 vehicles per year, and most of those were trucks and civilian cars. The industrial capacity simply didn't compare. America had assembly lines that stretched for kilometers. It had steel mills that produced more in a month than Germany produced in a year. It had an oil industry that made German synthetic fuel production look like a chemical laboratory. The intelligence estimates, Kniepkamp said quietly, suggest that American industrial output exceeds German industrial output by a factor of 4 to 1. In some categories, it's higher. Steel production, aluminum production, oil refining. They dwarf us in every measurable category. Müller sat down heavily on the edge of the Sherman's track. He looked at the tank, really looked at it, seeing it not as a piece of equipment, but as a symbol of something much larger. This crude, simply built vehicle represented an industrial philosophy completely different from Germany's. Where Germany built masterpieces in limited numbers, America built adequate solutions in unlimited numbers. "We can still win," Müller said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Our tanks are better, our crews are better trained, our tactics are superior, quality will defeat quantity." Kniepkamp wanted to believe that. He had spent his entire career believing that German engineering excellence was insurmountable, that precision and sophistication would always triumph over crude mass production. But he was an engineer, and engineers dealt in numbers, in mathematics, in cold calculations that didn't care about ideology or national pride. Kniepkamp spent the next 3 days writing the most important document of his career. It was 15 pages long, dense, with technical specifications, production comparisons, and strategic analysis. He detailed every aspect of the Sherman, its strengths, its weaknesses, its design philosophy. But the core of the report was the production numbers and what they meant. The report's conclusion was stark and unambiguous. The American M4 Sherman represents not a superior tank design, but a superior production philosophy. The United States has accepted performance compromises in exchange for manufacturing simplicity, creating a tank that is adequate rather than excellent, but that can be produced in numbers that make excellence irrelevant. Current intelligence estimates suggest American production capacity exceeds German capacity by ratios that cannot be overcome through tactical or technical superiority. If these estimates are accurate, Germany faces an enemy that can afford to lose 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still gain ground through numerical superiority. He added a final paragraph, the words coming slowly because they were difficult to write, difficult to accept. It is this engineer's professional opinion that the war's outcome will not be determined by the quality of our tanks, but by the quantity of enemy tanks. We are entering a phase of warfare where industrial capacity matters more than technical sophistication. Germany does not possess the industrial infrastructure to compete with American production on current trajectories. The report went to the Army Weapons Office in Berlin on March 29, 1943. Kniepkamp included photographs of the Sherman, detailed measurements, test results, and the intelligence assessments of American production capacity. He marked it urgent and requested immediate dissemination to high command. 3 days later, he received a response. The Army Weapons Office acknowledged receipt of the report and thanked him for his thorough analysis. They noted his concerns about American production capacity and assured him that leadership was aware of the situation and developing appropriate countermeasures. The response was professional, bureaucratic, and completely non-committal. Kniepkamp read the response twice, looking for any indication that someone in Berlin understood the implications. He found nothing. The response treated his report like routine technical analysis, like a maintenance assessment or a quality control review. They had read his words, but hadn't heard his message. "They don't believe it," Müller said, reading over his shoulder. "Or they don't want to believe it." "They think I'm exaggerating," Kniepkamp replied. "They think the intelligence estimates are inflated, that the Americans can't possibly produce tanks at these rates, that our spies are being fed misinformation." But the intelligence wasn't wrong. Over the next 6 months, as fighting intensified in North Africa and then Sicily and then Italy, more Shermans appeared on the battlefield. German tank crews began reporting encounters with American armor in growing numbers. What had been occasional contact in Tunisia became frequent in Sicily and constant in Italy. Everywhere German forces engaged American units, there were Shermans, more Shermans, endless Shermans. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The after-action reports confirmed what Kniepkamp's analysis had predicted. German tanks achieved favorable kill ratios. A Panzerfaust could typically destroy 2 or 3 Shermans before being knocked out. A Tiger could sometimes destroy 8 or 10. But it didn't matter, because the Shermans kept coming. For every American tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. German tank losses, meanwhile, couldn't be replaced at anywhere near the rate of American losses. In July 1943, Kniepkamp received new intelligence estimates. American Sherman production for the first half of the year had exceeded 12,000 tanks, 12,000 Shermans in 6 months. That was more than Germany's entire tank production for 1942, all tank types combined. And production was still increasing. The intelligence included photographs now taken by reconnaissance aircraft flying high over American factories. The images showed assembly lines, unlike anything in Germany. Vast open floors where tanks moved down production lines like cars, where partially completed vehicles sat in rows waiting for components, where finished tanks filled storage yards by the hundreds. One photograph showed the Chrysler tank arsenal from above. Kniepkamp studied it with a magnifying glass, counting the tanks visible in the storage yard. He stopped counting at 300. The photograph showed only a portion of the facility. August 1943. Kniepkamp was summoned to Berlin for a meeting with Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer had read Kniepkamp's report and wanted to discuss its implications. The meeting took place in Speer's office, a large room with maps covering the walls showing production facilities across Germany and occupied territories. Speer was younger than Kniepkamp expected, only 38 years old, but his reputation was formidable. He had taken over armaments production the previous year and had dramatically increased output through rationalization and improved organization. If anyone in Germany's leadership understood industrial capacity, it was Speer. Your report on the American Sherman tank, Speer began, without preamble, the production estimates. You believe they're accurate? I do, Kniepkamp said. Multiple intelligence sources confirm similar numbers. The Americans are producing between 2,000 and 2,500 Sherman tanks monthly, and that number is increasing. Speer walked to a map showing German tank production facilities. We're currently producing approximately 450 tanks per month, all types combined. Panzer IVs, Panthers, Tigers, assault guns. That's up from 300 at the start of the year. I've increased production by 50% in 8 months. He turned to face Kniepkamp. To match American Sherman production alone, I would need to increase our output by a factor of 5. That's not counting their other tanks, their tank destroyers, their armored vehicles, just the Shermans. Is it possible? Kniepkamp asked. Speer laughed, a bitter sound. No, it's mathematically impossible with our current industrial capacity. We don't have enough steel. We don't have enough skilled workers. We don't have enough machine tools. We don't have enough electricity to power the factories we'd need to build. I could increase production to maybe 700 tanks per month if I had unlimited resources and 2 years. The Americans are building 3,000 per month now. He sat down at his desk, suddenly looking tired. I've seen the intelligence reports you've seen. I've seen the photographs of their factories. Do you know what the most terrifying part is? The Americans are barely trying. They've converted some automobile factories to tank production, but not all of them. They're still producing civilian cars. They're still making washing machines and refrigerators. Their economy's running at maybe 60% military production, and they're still outproducing us 5-1. Kniepkamp felt something cold settle in his stomach. What happens when they go to full military production? They won't need to, Speer said. They're already producing more than enough to win. The question isn't whether they can outproduce us. The question is whether our tactical and technical superiority can overcome their material superiority. And I don't know the answer to that question. He pulled out his own set of reports, production figures, and strategic assessments. Your Sherman tank, the one you examined at Kassel. It's inferior to our Panzer IV in direct combat. Our intelligence confirms that in tank versus tank engagements, we maintain favorable kill ratios. But here's what keeps me awake at night. Speer opened a folder marked with red security seals. Inside were projections, graphs showing production rates over time. By the end of 1944, American factories will have produced approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks. 50,000. Even assuming generous kill ratios in our favor, even assuming we destroy 3 Shermans for every German tank lost, we cannot sustain that rate of attrition. We don't have 50,000 tanks. We don't have 15,000 tanks. We'll be lucky to field 5,000 tanks by the end of next year. The implications were obvious and terrible. Germany could win every tank battle and still lose the war through simple arithmetic. The Americans could afford to trade tanks at unfavorable ratios because they had unlimited replacements. Germany couldn't afford to lose at all because every tank destroyed was irreplaceable. December 1943. Kniepkamp was invited to observe test firing of the new Panther tank, Germany's response to the T-34 and, by extension, to the Sherman. The Panther was magnificent. Everything the Sherman wasn't, sleek and powerful, with sloped armor that rivaled Soviet designs and a long 75mm gun that could penetrate any Allied tank at extreme ranges. The test crew put the Panther through its paces, and Kniepkamp watched with professional admiration. This was German engineering at its finest, a tank that combined firepower, armor protection, and mobility in a package that outclassed anything the Allies fielded. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even see it, but after the demonstration, while discussing production timelines with the project officer, Kniepkamp asked the question that mattered: how many Panthers can we build per month? We're targeting 250 units per month by mid-1944, the officer replied proudly. That's a significant increase from our current rate. 250 Panthers per month. Kniepkamp did the arithmetic automatically now, couldn't help himself. The Americans were producing 3,000 Shermans per month. Even if a Panther was worth 5 Shermans in combat, an optimistic assumption, Germany would need to produce 600 Panthers per month just to maintain parity. Is it possible to increase production beyond 250 per month? Kniepkamp asked. The officer shook his head. Not without significant expansion of manufacturing facilities, which would take years. The Panther is complex, requires precision manufacturing, skilled workers. It's not something you can produce on a simple assembly line like... He trailed off, suddenly realizing the implication. Like a Sherman, Kniepkamp finished quietly. The officer nodded, uncomfortable. The Sherman is crude, simple, mass-produced like a commercial vehicle. The Panther is a precision instrument. Yes, Kniepkamp agreed, and they'll build 12 Panthers for every 1,000 Shermans. The precision instrument versus the crude tool, except the crude tool appears in numbers that make precision irrelevant. January 1944. Kniepkamp received a visitor at Kassel, an American engineer, a prisoner of war who had worked at the Fisher body plant before being drafted and then captured in Italy. The man's name was Robert Henderson, and he was being held at a nearby POW camp. The German authorities had allowed him to visit the testing grounds as part of an intelligence-gathering effort. Henderson walked around the captured Sherman with obvious familiarity, pointing out features and explaining design decisions. He seemed eager to talk, perhaps grateful for a break from camp routine, perhaps proud of the tank he'd helped build. "I worked on the suspension assembly line," Henderson said. "We built 32 complete suspension units per shift, 3 shifts per day. That's 96 suspension units daily from just our section of the factory." Kniepkamp did the mathematics. "How many complete tanks does your factory build per day?" "When I was there, around 12 tanks per day, but they were expanding production. Management was talking about reaching 15 per day by the end of the year. 15 tanks per day, from a single factory. That was more than most German facilities, produced in a month." "How many workers does your factory employ?" "About 40,000, Henderson said, "but most of them aren't skilled craftsmen. The work is specialized but simple. I was a mechanic before the war, but most of my co-workers had no mechanical experience. They learned their specific job in a week or two. Same motion, repeated thousands of times. Anyone can do it." That was the secret of American mass production. Breaking complex manufacturing into simple, repetitive tasks that required minimal training. German tank factories employed skilled craftsmen who understood the entire vehicle, who could machine parts to precise tolerances, who took pride in their workmanship. American factories employed ordinary workers who performed single specialized tasks without necessarily understanding the larger system. "The Sherman is inferior to our tanks," Kniepkamp said. "You know this, yes? Thinner armor, weaker gun, less sophisticated engineering." Henderson shrugged. "Sure, but it works. It's reliable, easy to fix, and we can build a whole bunch of them real quick. That's what matters, right? Having enough tanks?" "German military doctrine," Kniepkamp explained, "prioritizes quality over quantity. One superior tank is worth more than several inferior tanks." "Maybe," Henderson said, "but what if the inferior tanks keep coming? What if you destroy 10 and 20 more show up? Quality's great until you run out of quality and the other guys still got plenty of quantity." It was the same argument Kniepkamp had been having with himself for a year. The American prisoner, with no formal education in military strategy, had grasped the fundamental truth that German high command refused to accept. In a war of attrition, quantity was quality. Before Henderson was escorted back to camp, he asked one question. "You guys going to build your own Sherman? Copy our design?" Kniepkamp shook his head. "The Sherman's simplicity requires a manufacturing infrastructure we don't possess. We can't replicate your mass production methods without rebuilding our entire industrial system, which would take years. By the time we could build Sherman equivalents at scale, the war would be over." "Yeah," Henderson said quietly. "I guess it would." By April 1944, reports from the Eastern Front indicated that American-made vehicles were appearing in Soviet service. Lend-Lease shipments included not just raw materials, but complete vehicles, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, even tanks. The Soviet war machine, already formidable, was being augmented by American industrial output. German forces on the Eastern Front now faced Soviet T-34s, supported by American trucks, carrying supplies, American jeeps transporting commanders, American aircraft providing air cover. It was Germany against the combined industrial might of both the Soviet Union and the United States, an equation that made victory mathematically impossible. Kniepkamp requested updated intelligence estimates on total Allied tank production. The numbers, when they arrived, were crushing. America was now producing 4,000 tanks per month, not just Shermans, but tank destroyers, light tanks, specialized variants. Britain was producing several hundred tanks per month. The Soviet Union was producing over 2,000 tanks per month. Combined Allied tank production exceeded 8,000 vehicles monthly. Germany, even with Speer's improvements and increased efficiency, was producing approximately 500 tanks per month. 8,000 Allied tanks per month versus 500 German tanks per month. A 16-to-1 production advantage. Even assuming generous kill ratios, even assuming German tanks destroyed 3 Allied tanks for each German loss, the Allies could afford to lose over 2,000 tanks per month and still gain ground. Germany couldn't afford to lose 500 tanks per month, because that was the entirety of production. In his journal, Kniepkamp wrote, "We are watching industrial civilization destroy military civilization, all the tactical skill, all the technical sophistication, all the training and experience of the Wehrmacht means nothing against enemies who can replace their losses 16 times faster than we can replace ours. This is not warfare, this is mathematics, and we are on the wrong side of the equation." June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The reports that reached Kassel described an invasion fleet of 6,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supported by material superiority that made resistance almost suicidal. German defenders fought with skill and courage, extracting heavy casualties, but they were fighting against an enemy that could absorb those casualties and keep coming. American forces landed with specialized tanks, amphibious tanks that swam ashore, tanks equipped with flails for clearing mines, tanks with flamethrowers, tanks with bulldozer blades. They had tank variants for every conceivable purpose, and when one type didn't work, they switched to another. They had spares, replacements, backup equipment for their backup equipment. German forces had what they had, and when something broke or was destroyed, it stayed broken because there were no replacements. The battles in Normandy followed predictable patterns. German forces would establish defensive positions. Allied forces would probe those defenses, encounter resistance, and withdraw. Then American artillery would pulverize the German positions for hours, sometimes days. Then Allied aircraft would bomb what was left. Then, only then, would the tanks advance, moving methodically through devastated landscapes where organized resistance had been destroyed by sheer weight of explosives. German commanders reported firing everything they had, destroying dozens of Allied tanks, and still being overrun by sheer numbers. One report from a Panzer Battalion commander described destroying 47 Allied tanks in 3 days of fighting, then retreating because they'd run out of ammunition and fuel and faced an enemy that just kept advancing with fresh tanks. Kniepkamp received a request from field commanders. Could the testing facility provide tactical recommendations for fighting Shermans? What were the best methods for destroying them efficiently? What were their critical weaknesses? He wrote a response based on a year of testing and analysis. The M4 Sherman's primary weaknesses are thin frontal armor, vulnerable to anti-tank guns at combat ranges, lack of sloped protection, and relatively weak armament. However, these technical weaknesses are operationally irrelevant given American tactical doctrine and material superiority. American forces do not engage in tank versus tank duels, where technical specifications matter. They use artillery and air power to destroy defensive positions, then advance with tanks in supporting roles. Recommendations: focus on destroying American artillery and air assets rather than engaging tanks directly. Preserve German armor for counterattacks rather than static defense. Accept that favorable kill ratios against Sherman tanks do not translate to tactical victories when the enemy can replace losses overnight. The response was coldly analytical, professional, and utterly hopeless. It said, in essence, you can't win, but here's how to lose more slowly. By August 1944, American Sherman production had reached 5,000 tanks per month, 5,000, 60,000 per year. In a single year, America would build more Shermans than Germany had built tanks of all types in the entire war to date. The numbers no longer shocked Kniepkamp. They just confirmed what he'd known since examining that first Sherman at Kassel in March 1943. Germany had already lost. The fighting would continue. Men would die. Cities would be destroyed, but the outcome was determined by industrial capacity, and that equation had only one solution. In his office, Kniepkamp kept a chart tracking American Sherman production alongside German tank production. The lines diverged month after month, American production climbing steadily while German production fluctuated due to bombing raids and resource shortages. By August 1944, the gap had become a chasm, 5,000 American tanks per month versus maybe 600 German tanks per month. Müller found him staring at the chart one evening. "We should stop tracking this," Müller said. "It's just depressing." "It's mathematics," Kniepkamp replied. "Depression is subjective. The numbers are objective, and the numbers say we've been defeated by the American industrial system." He gestured at the captured Sherman, still sitting in the testing grounds after 18 months. "That tank taught us everything we needed to know, not because it's superior. It isn't. But because it represents a manufacturing philosophy we can't compete with. The Americans accepted performance compromises to achieve unlimited production. We pursued perfection and achieved limited numbers. In a war of attrition, unlimited. Adequate defeats, limited, perfect every time." Kniepkamp survived the war and was interrogated by American intelligence officers. They asked him about German tank development, about testing procedures, about the captured Shermans he'd examined. At the end of the interrogation, one officer asked what had surprised him most about American tanks. Kniepkamp's answer was immediate. "Not the tanks themselves. Your Shermans were adequate but not exceptional. What surprised me was how many you could build. We knew you had industrial capacity, but we didn't understand the scale. You built tanks like commercial vehicles, treated them as expendable equipment, replaced them faster than we could destroy them. That was the genius. Not in designing a better tank, but in designing a tank you could build infinitely." The officer nodded. "We had good engineers, but we had better factories." "Yes," Kniepkamp agreed. "And in the end, the factories mattered more than the engineers." Years later, long after the war, Kniepkamp gave an interview to a military historian researching American tank production. The historian asked him about that first examination of the Sherman at Kassel in March 1943. "What did you think?" the historian asked. "When you first saw those production estimates, 3,000 tanks per month, what went through your mind?" Kniepkamp was quiet for a long moment, remembering that cold morning, the crude welds, the loose tolerances, the terrible recognition of what those imperfections meant. "I thought," he said finally, "it hurts to admit, but we've already lost. Not because your tank was better, it wasn't, but because you could build tanks faster than we could count them, and there's no tactical brilliance, no technical sophistication, no amount of training that can overcome that kind of industrial superiority." He paused, then added quietly, "We built masterpieces. You built solutions, and your solutions came in numbers that made our masterpieces irrelevant. That was the lesson. The one we learned too late. In war, adequate and infinite defeats, perfect and finite, every time." The story of Heinrich Kniepkamp and the Sherman tank is ultimately a story about the nature of modern warfare. It's about the moment when one of Germany's finest engineers realized that technical excellence, precision engineering, and tactical brilliance. All the things that had made German armored forces dominant in the early years of the war were being rendered irrelevant by American industrial capacity. The Sherman was never the best tank of World War II. It was outgunned by German Panthers and Tigers. Its armor was thinner, its design less sophisticated. In direct combat, German tanks achieved consistently favorable kill ratios, but none of that mattered because the Americans could afford to lose 3 Shermans for every German tank destroyed and still overwhelm German forces through sheer numbers. The genius of the Sherman wasn't in its design specifications, but in its production philosophy. Every decision about the Sherman, from its aircraft engine to its simple suspension to its loose manufacturing tolerances, was made with mass production in mind. The Americans built a tank that was good enough to fight effectively and simple enough to build in unlimited numbers. They accepted performance compromises in exchange for manufacturing simplicity, and that trade-off won the war. Germany, meanwhile, pursued perfection. German tanks were engineering marvels, precision instruments that required skilled craftsmen and sophisticated manufacturing facilities. They were better than Allied tanks in almost every measurable way. But Germany couldn't build enough of them. The mathematical reality was brutal and inescapable. No amount of quality could overcome the quantity gap when that gap was 16-1. This is the lesson that Kniepkamp discovered that cold morning in March 1943, examining crude welds and loose tolerances on a captured Sherman. He understood immediately what it would take German high command years to accept, that modern industrial warfare was decided not by who built the best weapons, but by who built the most weapons. The Americans had turned warfare into an industrial process, and Germany, with its artisanal approach to manufacturing, couldn't compete. The Sherman tank stands as a monument to a profound truth about warfare in the industrial age. Adequate solutions in unlimited quantities will always defeat perfect solutions in limited quantities. It's a lesson that has applications far beyond World War II. A reminder that in any prolonged conflict, industrial capacity and production philosophy matter as much as, or more than, technical superiority. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Our